Right, so good afternoon, Euro. This is a continuation of the Richard III opening soliloquy that I started for the other day. There have been a few issues with recording, so hence why the obviously physical change in me, the shave and so on. But pretty much, if you recall, when we were looking at the Shakespeare, the heroes and villains, it was very much with a focus on Shakespeare's characters being very, very human, okay? And by that I mean being driven by emotions. And one thing we can say about ourselves, and with characterization in a play being a reflection of ourselves, of human nature, one of the things we can say that a good character in a novel, in a play, anything like that, tends to be one which is multi-layered. And by that I mean sometimes our motivations, the way we conduct ourselves, our behaviour, isn't always very obvious. An obvious version of that is someone who feels very insecure or lacking in confidence can sometimes come across as very, very forward and confident. Okay? So what are we talking about here? Well, if you remember the opening section of Richard III's soliloquy, the only Shakespeare play that opens with a soliloquy when he's talking to the audience, particularly as a villain, the opening section was very much about how he feels about war. And I know that Miss Mustafa and Miss Panu have been putting on worksheets for you to look at, and hopefully these videos will complement and accompany those worksheets. The second section of the soliloquy is about how Richard feels about himself. And I think in the last sort of bit that I'd got to, I'd pretty much reached this bit here, okay, where it established that Richard feels different. We get that by that conjunction but, okay, and that starts off this second section, but I. We also said in this one we have that repetition of the I's throughout this thing, where actually if it's always talking about I, me, if you talk to one of your friends or family members and it's always using that pronoun I or me, you'd say that that person is very much focused on themselves. And that's very much Richard as well. He feels isolated, he feels alone, he feels very, very different. And that might go some way in explaining why he acts the way that he does, based on his feelings. If you recall, I said last time that he feels though he is not shaped for sportive tricks, which is probably something which is beyond simply not being good at sport. He's deformed, he's got that hunchback, okay? He's got that withered arm, okay? So physically, he is not athletic, okay? Doesn't mean he's not strong, but he's not athletic, okay? And because of that, he says, I do not court an amorous looking glass. He looks in that mirror, okay, and he says to himself, I'm not pretty, I'm not a good looking person in my reflection, okay? I, that and rudely stamped. And I think I also went through last time the idea of the stamp there is the emblem that symbolises Richard. The stamp literally that we have on a ring or on a stamp itself that he'd put on that piece of wax, and it'd be the thing which would be, that logo would be on all of the things that signify Richard. So if you go around, I mentioned before the Wars of the Roses, you had particular roses that represent the houses, the Tudor rose, a mixture of red and white, our current royal family's coat of arms with a lion and a unicorn on it. Those are things which symbolise that particular people, or that particular royal family. Richard's one is the boar, okay, so not a pretty animal again, and it's appropriate that that's what symbolises him. So I, that am and rudely stamped, but he also feels as though that his body has been marked. Okay? But, and this is where we start understanding him a bit more, what is he angry at the world about? Now this is not surprising, okay? And want loves majesty. Now the idea of something being majestic, okay, is obviously powerful, okay? And he wants love. This is a man who wants love in his life. We all want love. We want to be loved and we want to love. But because of his isolation, because of his loneliness, and because people don't find him physically attractive, and we've said in the previous section to this, that at parties, the party to celebrate the ends of the Wars of the Roses, no one's looking at Richard and saying, there's an attractive man, okay? Instead, they're looking at him saying, there is somebody who is deformed. So he wants love, but he is not going to have it. He's not going to have that sort of romantic connection with anybody. And then we go through this word euphemism, okay, which is the one I mentioned last time as well. A euphemism is a more pleasant way of saying something unpleasant. So in this particular case, he is using euphemisms or euphemistic words to describe his deformity, to describe that hunchback, to describe that withered arm, and the way that he walks and so on. I that am curtailed of fair proportion. Curtailed means unfinished. Okay, so in this case, the proportions that should be in his body, that we all think we'll have in terms of the head, the body, arms, legs, and so on. Okay, he has not got all those proportions. At least if he has, he's had bits put where they shouldn't be and other bits taken away and so on. Now this is a very, very important line. Okay, and it explains so much about Richard and his motivations. He feels cheated of feature by dissembling nature. Now I've put a capital N on that, because when we talk about nature, who or what is it that we're talking about? When we talk about nature, we are talking about God. And whether you're a religious person or not, and at this time, of course, people were much more religious. Okay? We think back to that term, the divine right of kings. It was thought that the king was a direct messenger from God. And one of the things the Elizabethans believed in was this idea of something called the chain of being, or a hierarchy of being, and at the top of that was God. At the bottom of it were animals. Okay, probably insects are right down at the bottom. But kings were right up there, okay, along with saints and so on. So they thought actually in terms of this, that if you are there and you are formed in your mother's womb, the person or the entity which has put you together is God. And hopefully God has put you together in the right way. He assembles you. But Richard feels cheated, because rather than being assembled by nature, by God, he has been dissembled. He has been literally taken apart. And the bits which have been taken from him, as I said, in some cases they've just been taken away, but in other cases they've been put in other places where they shouldn't be. Now, what is the essence of that? Why am I saying that? Because this comes back to Shakespeare writing about characters. If you remember, the thing that you're being asked to judge, and this is very much down to you, this is again what literature is all about. It's about you making judgments. There is no right and wrong. I don't know what was going through Shakespeare's mind 400 years ago when he wrote this, but I can make my inferences, my deductions from it. But it is very much down to you. Okay? But when we actually look at the person, what is his motivation for doing everything he does? Why is it that he wants to turn the world upside down? The Elizabethans were also very much into order. If you look at an Elizabethan garden, if you've been somewhere like Hampton Court or Hever Castle, if you look at one of these things from above, it will seem very, very geometrically ordered, symmetrical, all that sort of thing. Because they thought they could control nature, or try to control nature in their gardens. But Richard wants to turn it all on its head. He said the person who is king, Edward IV, after that, Edward's sons, Edward and Richard. After that would be George, Duke of Clarence. So Richard's got these four people to get through in order to get to the throne, and he is angry at the world because he has that objective, he wants to pursue that, but it's not going to happen. So who's he angry with? What is the motivation behind that? God. God has made me this way, the world has made me this way, I'm going to get my own back. That's absolutely key to this. Now, I did say that at the beginning of this, when it comes to heroes and villains, sometimes there can be a bit of a grey area, okay? There are those people in our world nowadays who might be regarded as villainous, but to others, they are heroic. You might have people who have got very, very much heroic tendencies, but part of their nature has to be a little bit villainous, and that is quite subjective. It's different from different people's points of view, okay? But Richard here, we need to try and understand, is it an understandable human trait, a human characteristic, where if you have got something that you feel so innately angry about inside, you are going to try and do something about it? And this is what this play is all about. It is all about revenge. It's about Richard taking revenge on the world, on God, which he feels has treated him badly. So he goes on. I'm deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up. So he is born incomplete. And probably because of that, His parents would look at him and not treat him the same as they treated Edward, his older brother, and Clarence, his other older brother. When I said about there was this hierarchy, it's called the chain of being. And this is an idea of who or what was most important in society down to who or what was least important in society. Now, obviously, Richard is a nobleman. Richard is the Duke of Gloucester at the beginning of this play. But he says he is so lowly regarded that it's not just other people around court, let alone his own family, let alone other women who don't look at him in a certain way, but even when he stops in the street, so lame because of his deformity, and unfashionable, that dogs bark at me. So even something as low down that chain of being as dogs, all the way down here, they don't respect him. They bark at him in the street because of his appearance. And again, that's a source of great anger for him. Why I, in this weak piping time of peace, now you've got this real sort of plosives. Plosives are things like the alliteration there, again, a term you should know. The piping time of peace. You can really hear in the sound of his language how angry he is. We said in the previous section, he hates peacetime. He loves war. He hates the fact that there's no marching into battle now, but dancing instead. He hates the fact that their weapons, rather than being used to fight each other, are being hung up for decorations. And he hates the fact that actually men, rather than using all their energy in battle, are capering around. Read into that what you will. And dancing to the lascivious pleasings of a lute. And you get those plosives in that previous line as well. So he really hates peacetime. But because of this villainy, you've got to make this judgment. Are there things we admire about him? Is he sorry for himself? Does he decide to go away and hide in the shadows because of his deformity, because he doesn't look quite as he should do? I have no delight to pass away the time, unless to spy my shadow in the sun and descant on my own deformity. Now, we said before, the opening couplet of this entire soliloquy, the sun is a symbol for the king. Okay, remember we said that. The son of York, in the opening two lines of the soliloquy. So what does Richard do? He always feels in the shadow of his older brother, Edward IV. Okay, that's symbolic in itself. But equally, what does he do about it? Does he say, no, I'm feeling too sorry for myself to do anything? No. He sees that shadow. He sees the shadow with the hunchback. He sees himself standing next to these people who are standing upright and don't have deformity. But if you know what this word descant means, it means that I'm going to celebrate my uniqueness. I'm going to celebrate the fact that I'm different. And rather than actually it being something which is going to hold me back, it's going to be the motivation that I have to achieve what I want to. Now, there are lots of things that we would say would make Richard villainous. The things that he does, the people that he kills. And he wouldn't be alone in the medieval world to kill people on his way to get the throne, even members of his own family. But surely we should say that he deserves some of our respect for, in spite of his deformity, being brave, in spite of his deformity, celebrating his difference, and in spite of his deformity, going through everything to achieve that which he wants. And maybe that's something that you can think about when you come to make a judgment yourself. Okay? Right, and then we move on to the final part of the soliloquy. Okay, and do check on the system, like I said, that Miss Panu and Miss Mustafa have put some sheets there which I know. Okay, and if you've got any questions about it, as I said, just email me or your class teacher and we'll be able to answer them for you. This is the last little section of the opening soliloquy. Now, I said that the first words of the soliloquy, going back to the beginning section, was now. And that says that Richard is a man of action. Do you remember I said Shakespeare said there are two types of people, the thinkers and the doers? Well, Richard is a man of action. I'm going to get this done. I'm going to take the throne. I'm going to set that up. And this is a similar idea. Because of the way he feels about war and peace, because of the way that he's been treated by God but by everybody else, Therefore, because of those things, this is what I am going to do. Since I cannot prove a lover, he is not a romantic person, in an obvious sense, to entertain these fair, well-spoken days. And there's a real tone to the way that he says that. It's as if he's saying those words and holding them at a distance. He hates the idea of things being things like peacetime, being fair and well-spoken, because it's not in his nature, even though he's very, very good with language and can manipulate people accordingly. He is honest in his dishonesty. Look at that line there. I am determined. Well, that tells us a lot about Richard. He is determined. I am determined. Surely that is something which is a strength. To prove a villain. Now, if you are actually being asked to make a judgment on who is the worst villain, is it somebody, and you can, again, this is the beauty of Shakespeare, liken it to things that you know about humans now. That very first little presentation I did, I said that jealousy was jealousy back in the 16th century is the same as jealousy now. Ambition in Macbeth, the same then as now. Love, the same then as now. And Richard is saying, I am a villain. He is honest about how bad he is. Surely that is something that deserves some credit. Okay, rather than those people who just go through life making themselves out to be something good, or actually they are doing the unpleasant things behind the scenes. And hate the idle pleasures of these days. He hates sitting around partying, doing nothing. And then he admits what he's done in preparation of all this. Plots have I laid. So he's started plotting away behind the scenes. Do you remember I said there were three words? There was the idea of the vice character, the evil character, the showman, the person who plays up the audience, and the Machiavellian character. Big word but simple idea. He is willing to do anything it takes to get what he wants. And he's laid plots. Inductions dangerous by drunken prophecies, libels and dreams. So he's created this whole web. Remember I showed you that picture of Richard where he's like a spider? He's created this web of intrigue, this web of lies around court by whispering in people's ears, telling people things. And the main two people, if you think about who's between Richard and the throne, the main two people who stand between him and the throne are not his nephews, because they can be dealt with. And he does that in due course. The main two people he needs to deal with are the king, his oldest brother, Edward IV, and his second oldest brother, George, Duke of Clarence. So what does he do? To set my brother Clarence and the king in deadly hate. So he's going to one of them and he says, he says to Clarence, you need to watch Edward. And he says to Edward, you need to watch Clarence. So these two become rivals, okay? The one against the other. And if King Edward be as true and just, which a king should be, as I am subtle, false and treacherous. And again, he admits straight away exactly the way that he is. From the first speech in the play, he admits the way that he is. At the end of the play, Richard is killed, and I'll go on to this in a presentation probably tomorrow. Richard is killed in a battle. But the night before that battle, he is visited by the ghosts of all the people that he's killed. And it shows us that he's got a conscience. But he says to one of those ghosts three very, very simple words. I am I. I am what I am. This is the way I was born. This is the way that God designed me. I've been a villain. You've all treated me like a villain because of the way I look. So that is the way I'm going to be. I am I. As I am, subtle, false and treacherous. This day should Clarence closely be mewed up, which means imprisoned, by Edward, by his older brother, about a prophecy. And so one of the things that Richard had been doing is spreading the rumour around that Clarence and Edward would get into this rivalry. But he also started spreading a rumour around that there'd been a prophecy, okay, which means something which is predicted. That the murderers of Edward's heirs shall be. Now, Edward's heirs were the people who are coming to the throne next, so that would have been his son, Edward, and his other son, Richard. And what Richard was spreading around was that there was a prophecy, a prediction, that they were going to be murdered by G. And he led everyone to believe that that G meant George, Duke of Clarence. Of course, what happens is that Edward IV dies, whether it's by Richard we don't know. George, Duke of Clarence, is imprisoned by Edward and then drowned. And the two princes, those heirs of Edward, are put under the protection of their kind uncle Richard, who puts them in the Tower of London and they disappear. And Richard becomes king. Let's remember exactly what Richard's title is. He, at the beginning of the play, is Richard, Duke of Gloucester. G of Edward's heirs, the murderer, shall be Gloucester, not George, will be murdering the two nephews. Okay? And then people start approaching, dive thoughts down to my soul, here Clarence comes. And he's all very, very familiar and kind to Clarence. Okay? So what we've got there is that opening soliloquy. And hopefully what I've been able to do for you, just watch what I've done in those presentations, I think it's down to 4 or maybe even 5 presentations because they're a bit fragmented, is give an understanding, hopefully, of what Richard's motivations are. Hopefully give an understanding of some of the language in there so you can respond using some analytical language. But it should help you to come to some sort of initial judgment about how you feel about this character. How you feel about the fact that yes, he is a villain and he admits to it, but are there redemptive, redeeming things about his character which actually are quite heroic? We might even, beyond finding him attractive because he's a baddie, actually do quite like. Okay? So, have a go at the sheets that Miss Panu and Miss Mustafa have put up, and next time what I'll go through is what happens in the rest of the play so we can start making a bit more of a judgment about it. Hope you found that useful.